Alien girl tried to steal my tools. When I caught her, I realized why. Jack moved through docking bay 47 with his tool bag slung over one shoulder. The air smelled of fuel and rust, the usual perfume of a place where ships limped in for repairs. Dock workers shouted across the platforms, loaders clanged against hulls, and the buzz of machinery filled every corner. To Jack, it was all background noise. He had been working these bays for years, patching up ships that should have been retired decades ago, trading his skill for credits that never seemed to stretch far enough. He adjusted the strap of his bag and kept walking, eyes half focused on the job ahead. Another broken thruster, another day lost in grease and bolts. But then something unusual happened. A small tug pulled at the weight on his shoulder. At first, Jack thought it was nothing more than a docking clamp catching his bag, or maybe he had brushed against a loader passing too close. But then the tug came again, sharper this time, deliberate. Jack froze. Slowly, he glanced to the side, and that was when he saw it. A thin gray hand, no larger than a child's, slipping a wrench from the open flap of his bag and tucking it into a ragged satchel. His reaction was instant. He spun around, ready to bark a curse, ready to face down some desperate thief bold enough to rob him in broad daylight. But it was not a hardened worker. It was not a gang runner. It was not even someone old enough to know better. It was a little girl. She froze like a creature caught in a beam of light. Her eyes, too large for her small face, stared up at him wide and trembling. She was thin, painfully thin, with gray skin that clung too tightly to her bones. She could not have been more than 10 years old, at least in human reckoning. She clutched the satchel against her chest as if it were the only thing standing between her and punishment. Jack's voice came out harsher than he intended. "That is mine." He yanked the wrench back, the weight of the familiar tool solid in his hand. "Why are you stealing from me?" The girl flinched at his tone. Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, Jack noticed something else. Her arms, where her sleeves had slipped back, were covered in raw burns and shallow cuts. Scars, fresh and old, ran along her skin in a pattern no child should ever bear. The anger that had surged in him a moment before began to dissolve, replaced by something heavier and more unsettling. The girl finally whispered, her voice thin and brittle, as if speaking hurt. "The heater is broken. My brothers and sisters are cold." For a long moment, Jack just stared at her. 1,000 thoughts fought in his head. He had seen street kids before, half-wild and quick to steal. Lies came easily to them. They invented sob stories to get pity, to get food, to get whatever they could scrape together. That was what he told himself as he tightened his grip on the wrench. But there was something in her voice, something in her eyes, that made it difficult to believe this was just another trick. Jack drew in a breath, steadying himself. The dock around them bustled on, oblivious to the little standoff happening in its shadows. He should have just walked away. He should have reported her to security. But instead, against all the instincts that told him not to get involved, he asked, "What is your name?" She hesitated, clutching her satchel tighter, as if afraid even her name might be taken from her. Then, in a voice so soft he almost missed it, she said, "Lyra." Jack exhaled slowly. Lyra, a name that felt fragile, like glass about to break. He looked down at the wrench in his hand, then at the burns on her arms. He wanted to dismiss her story, to convince himself she was only another thief spinning a tale. But her eyes held no trick, no mockery, only desperation. Something stirred in him, something he had not felt in years. Curiosity, and something more dangerous than that. A flicker of concern. Jack tightened his grip on the wrench, still uncertain, but the look in Lyra's eyes clung to him like a weight. He could have left right then. He could have turned his back and let security sweep her up. But his boots did not move away. Instead, they followed when she turned, hesitating at first, then leading him into the shadows at the far edge of the bay. She glanced back often, as if afraid he might vanish or strike her down, but she kept moving, past the stacked containers, past the rusted hulls that no longer flew, and into the maintenance tunnels beneath the docking platforms. The air changed quickly here. The sharp bite of fuel and machinery gave way to damp, stale air that smelled of rot and rust. The lights flickered, barely strong enough to push back the dark. Jack followed, the echo of his footsteps sounding too loud against the narrow walls. He kept asking himself why he was doing this. Why was he letting some half-starved alien child drag him into the guts of the station? He had no answer. Maybe it was the way her hands shook as she clutched her satchel, or the way her shoulders curled in like she was carrying a weight far too heavy for her size. Finally, she stopped. A broken door hung open on one hinge, leading into a forgotten storage room. She slipped inside, and Jack followed. The sight made his stomach tighten. It was not just one child hiding in the shadows. It was dozens. Small figures huddled together under scraps of cloth and twisted metal, their breaths fogging in the cold air. The walls were lined with old cargo nets and broken crates that had been turned into makeshift shelters. Every pair of eyes that lifted toward him was hollow with hunger and rimmed with fear. In the far corner sat a heater unit, old and cracked, its casing split open. The machine was silent, its light dark, nothing more than a useless husk. Around it, the youngest children shivered and pressed together, seeking warmth that was no longer there. Lyra moved toward one of them, a boy no older than 6 by human standards. His skin was the same pale gray as hers, but he was weaker, his limbs trembling as if even the act of standing was too much. He leaned against her side, clutching her sleeve, his eyes glassy. "This is Torin," she whispered. "My brother." Jack swallowed hard. He had expected a trick, a scam, maybe even a group of older thieves waiting to jump him. But there was no trick here, just suffering. Children who should have been laughing and running through safe halls instead sat silent in the cold, their breath shallow, their bodies wrapped in whatever scraps they could find. He stepped closer to the broken heater, crouching down to inspect it. The casing was shattered, and the power cell inside had burned out long ago. He could see scorch marks along the wiring, the kind of damage that would have taken an experienced hand to repair. To these children, it might as well have been dead forever. Jack looked over his shoulder. Dozens of eyes watched him, waiting, but without hope. They were too used to disappointment, too used to being ignored. He set his tool bag down on the ground. The clatter made a few of the younger ones flinch, but he ignored it. His hands moved without thinking, pulling out the right tools, the motions as familiar as breathing. For years he had repaired ships, but in that moment it was not a thruster or a stabilizer in front of him. It was a heater, a machine that could mean the difference between life and death for children who had no one else. Behind him, Lyra spoke softly, almost afraid to disturb him. "Can you fix it?" Jack did not answer right away. He twisted wires together, replaced burnt fuses with spares from his bag, and tightened bolts that had long since rattled loose. His fingers were stiff from the cold, but they kept moving, guided by instinct. When the last wire was set, he pressed the switch. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then, with a low hum, the heater flickered to life. Light spread from its core, a soft glow that pushed back the shadows. Heat rolled outward, weak at first, then stronger, filling the room with a warmth that felt almost alive. The reaction was immediate. The children cried out, but not in fear. They rushed forward, pressing close to the heater, their hands outstretched to feel the warmth. The youngest laughed, a sound broken but real, and the older ones clung to each other as if they could not believe it. Jack leaned back on his heels, watching them. For years, tools had been nothing more than his way to earn credits. But right now, in this forgotten room filled with abandoned children, those tools meant everything. He glanced at Lyra. She stood with Torin pressed against her side, her eyes wide, shining with something that looked like hope. For the first time, Jack saw her not as a thief, not as a desperate trickster, but as a sister fighting to keep her family alive. And in that moment, his missing wrench did not matter. The glow of the heater filled the room, soft and steady, chasing away the bitter chill that had clung to every corner. Jack sat back, wiping his hands on a rag, though he could hardly feel the grease on his fingers. His eyes stayed on the children. They pressed close to the warmth, as if afraid it might vanish if they blinked. Some of them whispered to each other, their voices fragile, as if laughter was something they had forgotten how to use. Jack's chest tightened. He had spent years fixing machines for captains who never thanked him, for dockmasters who barely paid enough to keep him afloat. Those repairs had always felt empty, like pouring his skill into hollow shells. But this, watching the children stretch out their hands to the heat, watching their faces soften as the cold faded, this was different. This was not a job. This was life being handed back to them through the turn of a wrench. Lyra knelt beside the heater with Torin tucked against her. His shaking had lessened. His eyes half closed as warmth seeped back into his thin body. She looked up at Jack, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but no words came. She only nodded once, the kind of nod that carried more gratitude than speech ever could. Jack could have left then. He had done his part. The heater was running, the room was warm, and his conscience could rest easy. But when he stood and looked at the children again, he realized how fragile their relief was. The heater gave them warmth, but nothing else. Their clothes were little more than rags. Their faces were drawn tight with hunger. Even with heat, the shadows of despair clung to them like a second skin. Jack picked up his bag. For a moment, the children stiffened, afraid he might take the warmth with him. He slung the strap over his shoulder and cleared his throat. "Stay close to the heater," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "It will hold for now." He turned and walked out of the room, the echoes of his boots fading into the tunnel. But even as he stepped back into the bay, he knew he would not leave it behind. Their eyes followed him. Lyra's silent plea burned in his mind. That night, long after the dock had gone quiet and the lights dimmed to a dull glow, Jack found himself returning. He carried a sack over one shoulder, heavier than usual. Inside were ration packs he had scraped together from his quarters, food he had been saving for himself. He told himself it was only once, that he would deliver the sack and walk away. But when he entered the storage room again, the reaction stopped him cold. The children looked up with wide eyes, their bodies tense, unsure of what he carried. When he pulled the ration packs free and set them on the floor, the silence broke. They swarmed forward, not with greed, but with trembling hands, each one clutching a pack as if it might vanish before they could taste it. Lyra waited until the others had taken theirs before she picked one up for herself and another for Torin. She handed it to him carefully, guiding his small fingers around it. The boy smiled faintly, the kind of smile that should have belonged to a child far younger than the hardships he had seen. Jack leaned against the wall, arms folded, trying to act as if this meant little to him. But the truth gnawed at him. Each bite they took, each spark of relief that crossed their faces, tightened the grip that room had on his heart. The next night he came again, this time with blankets, old and worn, scavenged from the corners of the bay where no one cared enough to notice. He spread them across the floor, and the children rushed to wrap themselves in the fabric, holding it close as if it were treasure. Night after night, Jack returned, sometimes with food, sometimes with scraps of clothing, sometimes with nothing but his tools and a few stories to distract the children from the endless shadows. He never told them why he came. Perhaps he did not know himself. All he knew was that leaving them to the cold and hunger felt impossible. In those nights, he began to hear their voices, their stories whispered in fragments. Children who had lost parents to accidents in the mines. Children abandoned by families too poor to feed them. Children sold to gangs and left behind when they grew too weak. Each story cut deeper than the last. Lyra spoke little, but Jack could see the way the others looked to her. She was small, no stronger than the rest, yet she carried herself as if the burden of all of them rested on her shoulders. Torin clung to her side constantly, his frail body leaning into hers as though her strength alone kept him standing. One evening, as Jack handed out the last of the rations he had brought, a thought struck him that made his blood run cold. He had been telling himself that the children were simply forgotten, left to rot in the tunnels. But the scars on their arms, the way some of them stiffened at sudden sounds, hinted at something darker. He lowered his voice when he asked Lyra, Do the gangs know you are here? The silence that followed told him everything. Lyra's eyes shifted to the floor. A boy across the room shuddered, pulling his blanket tighter. Another girl pressed her face into her knees and would not look up. They know, Lyra whispered at last. The guards too. They do not care. Sometimes the gangs come. They take things. They say we belong to them. Her voice cracked, but she forced the words out. We hide when we can, but they always find us. Jack's jaw clenched. His hands curled into fists at his sides. He had fixed a heater. He had brought food. He had given blankets. But against gangs who treated children like property, what could a mechanic with a wrench do? Yet as he looked around the room, at the frightened faces that had begun to trust him, he knew the answer. He could not walk away. Not anymore. Days turned into weeks, and Jack found himself caught in a rhythm he had never expected. He still worked the docks during the day, patching hulls and repairing thrusters, but each evening his path no longer ended at his quarters. Instead, it carried him back into the tunnels, back to the abandoned rooms where dozens of alien children waited. The station had always felt hollow to him, a machine that swallowed men whole and gave nothing in return. But now, when he pushed open the crooked door and heard the quiet stir of little voices, it felt different. It felt alive. The children greeted him not with fear anymore, but with small smiles and whispers of relief. Their eyes, once empty, now followed him with trust. Jack brought what he could. Some nights it was extra rations hidden from his own meals. Other nights it was tools, scraps of metal, or wire that he repurposed into makeshift lamps to push the darkness back. He even brought blankets from old storage crates, patched together into something warm enough to cover more than one child. They began to talk to him, little by little. Stories spilled out in pieces, like shattered glass scattered across the floor. A boy named Cale told him how he had been left behind when his father died in a mining accident. A girl named Senna whispered about the guards who had driven her from the market when she tried to beg for food. Another child, barely old enough to form full sentences, spoke of hiding under floorboards while men with blades shouted through the tunnels. Jack listened. He never promised them anything he could not give, but he listened. That alone seemed to matter more than the food or the blankets. Lyra remained different. She did not share her stories freely. She spent her nights moving from child to child, tending to them as if she were far older than she looked. She made sure Torin ate before she did, that the younger ones stayed close to the heater, that no one was left shivering. When Jack brought food, she always waited until the last child had taken their share before she touched her own. Jack found himself watching her more than he meant to. She carried a weight far heavier than any child should. In her silence, he saw strength. In her scars, he saw battles no child should have fought. One night, as Jack handed Torin a blanket, the boy smiled up at him, small and tired but real. "You are like our big brother now," Torin said softly. The words struck deeper than Jack expected. He felt the room grow quiet around him, dozens of eyes waiting for his response. He swallowed, unsure how to answer. He was no one's brother. He was a mechanic, a man who fixed machines because they were easier than people. But when he looked at Torin's hopeful face, at the children leaning closer to the warmth he had brought, he realized that maybe it did not matter who he thought he was. To them, he was something they had not had in a long time. Someone who cared. The comfort did not last. Rumors began to drift down the tunnels. Whispered warnings carried on fearful voices. The gangs had noticed. Supplies were going missing. Someone was helping the gutter rats survive. And that someone was human. Jack heard it first from an older dockhand who pulled him aside one afternoon. The man's face was weathered, his voice low with unease. "You are stirring up trouble you do not want, Jack. Those kids are nothing but a mark for the gangs. You put yourself between them and their profit, and they will come for you, human or not." Jack brushed it off with a grunt, but the warning sank deep. That night, when he entered the children's refuge, he looked at them differently. He saw not only their hunger and their fear, but the danger pressing closer every day. Lyra must have seen it in his eyes. She approached him quietly, Torin asleep against her shoulder. "You do not have to come back," she said, her voice soft but firm. "They will hurt you if they find out. We can survive like we always have. Jack shook his head. Surviving is not the same as living. She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to understand why a man who owed them nothing would keep risking himself. At last, she looked away, her arms tightening around her brother. The bond between them grew stronger with every passing night. Jack found himself looking forward to the tunnels more than anything else. For years, he had walked through life with a wall around his heart, telling himself it was easier that way. But Lyra and the children had torn through that wall with nothing more than their need. They had stolen his excuses, piece by piece, until all that was left was the truth. He cared, and caring meant he would not stop, no matter what came next. The warning came sooner than Jack had hoped. He was moving through the tunnels late one night, a bag of ration packs slung over his shoulder, when he sensed something was wrong. The air felt too still. The usual echoes of dripping pipes and scurrying vermin were gone, replaced by a silence that pressed in on him. When he reached the crooked door to the children's refuge, it was standing open. A cold wave of dread swept through him. He dropped the bag and rushed inside. The heater was still glowing, but the children were huddled in the far corner, their eyes wide with fear. Lyra stood in front of them, her arms spread as if her thin frame could shield them all. Her face was pale, her lips pressed tight, and her body shook though she refused to step aside. Across the room stood a group of figures, their shadows long in the dim light. 6 of them, armed with knives and blunt weapons. At their head was a scarred alien with broad shoulders and skin the color of iron. His right eye was clouded white, the mark of some old wound, and his mouth twisted into a sneer as he looked Jack up and down. Jack recognized him at once. Varkesh, a gang leader who ruled the underbelly of Docking Bay 47 with cruelty that made even hardened dockhands keep their heads down. Well, Varkesh drawled, his voice low and dangerous. The human rat has been feeding my property. He gestured toward the children with one scarred hand. Did you think no one would notice? Mechanic? Did you think you could play hero without paying the price? Jack's stomach churned, but his legs carried him forward anyway. He stepped between the thugs and the children, his hand tightening around the wrench at his side. The tool felt pitifully small against their blades, but it was all he had. They are not your property, Jack said, his voice steady even as his heart pounded in his chest. They are children. Varkesh's laugh echoed through the room, sharp and cruel. Children? No. They are mouths that work for scraps. They are leverage. They are coin. And you? He stepped closer, his ruined eye fixed on Jack. You are standing in my way. The thugs shifted behind him, eager, ready to strike. Jack knew the odds. 1 against 6, with nothing but a wrench. He could not win. But when he looked back and saw Lyra's arms wrapped around Torin, when he saw the children pressed together with terror in their eyes, something inside him hardened. He planted his feet, lifted the wrench, and met Varkesh's gaze head-on. Then you will have to go through me. The silence stretched, thick and electric. The thugs shifted again, but none stepped forward. Something in Jack's eyes must have given them pause. Something raw. A fire that burned brighter than fear. The children's frightened cries filled the air, and the sound seemed to hang over the room like a shield. For a moment, even Varkesh hesitated. His sneer faltered, his ruined eye narrowing as if he could not believe what he was seeing. A single human standing unarmed against half a dozen. Not for profit, not for glory, but for gutter rats no one else cared about. Finally, Varkesh spat on the floor. You are a fool, mechanic. A fool who does not know how this station works. But fools die fast in these tunnels. He gestured for his men to fall back. Enjoy your little victory while it lasts. The station will crush you sooner than I can. With that, he turned and stalked out, his thugs following reluctantly. Their footsteps faded into the dark, leaving only the ragged sound of the children's breathing. Jack lowered the wrench slowly, his arms trembling with the weight of what had just happened. He had expected to be cut down, to bleed out on the cold floor. Instead, he still stood and the children still lived. Lyra stepped forward, her eyes shining with something he could not name. Fear, relief, gratitude. She reached for his hand, small and shaking, and held it for a moment. You did not run, she whispered. Jack squeezed her hand once before letting go. Neither did you. Behind her, the children stirred, their fear slowly giving way to something new. Hope. Jack knew then that there would be no turning back. He had crossed a line, one that could never be undone. The gangs would not forget. The guards would not protect him. He had made himself a target. But as he looked at the faces gathered around the heater, he knew he would face whatever came. For the first time in years, he had found something worth fighting for. In the days that followed, the story spread like fire through Docking Bay 47. Word of a human standing against Varkesh and his thugs traveled from the lowest tunnels to the highest catwalks. At first, people laughed at it, just a rumor, surely. But the laughter faded when the gangs stopped harassing the children. When no guards came to drag them away. When a single mechanic kept walking the tunnels every night, carrying food, carrying blankets, carrying the weight of a choice no one else had dared make. And the strangest thing of all? Others began to follow his lead. A merchant who had once turned his face away slipped a sack of fruit into Jack's hands. A dock worker brought old coats, patched but warm. Even a guard, gruff and silent, left a box of ration bars at the tunnel's entrance without saying a word. Nobody admitted openly to helping, but the signs were there. The children were no longer invisible. Inside their refuge, the broken heater still glowed, but now its warmth wasn't just metal and wires. It was life. The children laughed again. Their thin frames filled out. Their hollow eyes softened into something almost unrecognizable, joy. Torin was strong enough to run in circles around the room, his laughter ringing off the rusted walls. Lyra no longer stood between the younger ones and the world, because she knew someone else was standing with her. One night, Jack lingered by the heater as the children drifted off to sleep, their tiny forms curled under mismatched blankets. The steady hum of the machine filled the quiet. He sat with his wrench across his knees, staring at its worn handle. That tool had once been everything, his trade, his identity, his survival. But now it felt like a symbol of something far greater. Lyra stirred beside him, blinking sleepily. She sat up and whispered, "Jack!" He turned, smiling faintly. "Go back to sleep, little thief." She shook her head. "I didn't steal your tools that night." Her voice was soft but certain. "I stole your excuses." The words struck him deeper than she could ever know. For so long he had hidden behind them. Too tired, too small to matter, too broken to fight. But this child, with her trembling hands and stubborn eyes, had torn all that away. Jack looked over the room one last time. The children slept soundly, no longer shivering in the cold. They had warmth. They had food. They had hope. And in that moment he understood. He had come to Docking Bay 47 as a mechanic. But he stayed as their guardian.